If you are container gardening in a city apartment like me, you know that automated water irrigation isn't always possible, and while this is fine most of the time, what happens when you have to step out for a few days, a few weeks? Do you just kind of hope for the best and hopefully nothing dies too much? Well, today I will be setting up a new system while I am on vacation, so if you're interested in seeing what I do to ensure my plants' survival, keep watching. In the past, whenever I've gone on vacation, I've pretty much just let the garden fend for itself because honestly that was the easiest thing I could do. I usually time my planting schedule to ensure that whatever is out in the garden isn't something that I would be incredibly sad about if I came back and it was freaking dead, because most of the time everything was dead when I came back. You know, I kind of had to make peace with it as someone who has to garden on a patch of concrete. If you've seen the last video, you know that I've been doing a bit of a garden reset, and there are so many plants out here that I have put out recently that I don't want to die. I will not be able to put in an automated irrigation system still, but we're going to make it work. Step one, we are going to mulch. You can use whatever mulch you have. You can use straw, any cardboard. You can kind of break that down and put it on top of the beds. You can use old leaves, but for me, the most cost-effective solution that I found to mulch is rabbit bedding. It may seem a little weird at first, but this bedding is made out of pine, which is what an option of mulch could be, and so it is really cost effective. I believe this entire bag of 41 liters was about $10, which is a really good deal for mulch. As you can see here, the wood shavings in this bedding is a very nice consistency. It's not too large, so it'll allow water to permeate through, but it's still heavy enough to be able to provide the benefits of mulch. Normally I would have mulched my beds already, but I've noticed that rats kind of like them, and so I feel like when I have them out, they tend to notice my garden a little bit more than when I don't have them out. So honestly, I try to delay this process as much as possible, even though there are so many benefits of mulching, just because I feel like once the rats, and you know if you're a city gardener, once the rats find your garden for that season, it's like, it's war. Like at that point, you have to do everything in your power to prevent them from munching on everything. So that's kind of why I'm doing this a little bit later. There may be a few reasons why you would want to consider mulching your plants. The most important reason as it relates to this video is that it helps lock in a lot of the moisture and the water in the soil that otherwise would quickly dry out. So I am primarily gardening in 2 to 10 gallon grow bags and buckets, and as you can see here, it's a fabric bag that really loses water quickly because it seeps out of the bag. And so if you're gardening in something similar, even in the buckets, compared to something like a raised bed or gardening in the ground, you have way more soil in the little area that you're growing in, and that keeps moisture way longer than something small like a grow bag. And so putting mulch on top allows the soil to stay moist longer because the sun isn't directly hitting the top of the soil and drying it out. And when you have something this shallow, it's about, I want to say it's like no more than 12 feet tall, which is kind of shallow when you think about, you know, raised beds or gardening in the ground. That distance really dries out fast, and so if you have just a little layer of mulch on top, it allows you to preserve some of the moisture a little longer. Not too long, but definitely at least a few days in my experience. The good thing about mulching is that it chokes out the weeds that might potentially grow in a place you don't really want it to grow. And if I'm not going to be here to be able to manually pluck them out, I don't want to come back and have a completely random plant essentially having had colonized a pot that wasn't meant for it. And in some cases, for example like potato, they grow really fast, and I'm always finding potato volunteers in my garden, and so I don't want to come back and have, say, my eggplant losing a lot of nutrients or like on the cusp of death because a bunch of potatoes have decided to live in that bed instead. This is especially important if you are away for a little bit longer than 1 or 2 weeks. This is another one of my tomato plants. It's honestly not doing the best simply because I planted it thinking that we would get more sun, because we usually get more sun around this time, but it hasn't been as hot as I thought it was going to be, so it's not looking the healthiest, but she's still pushing through. As you can see here, the leaves are touching the soil, which is normal because plants touch the soil. In most cases it's fine, but in the case of something as disease prone, plants that have a longer growing season and tend to be very sensitive when it comes to their leaves picking up diseases such as tomatoes, I would say cucumbers, squash even, depending on the temperature in terms of powdery mildew. It's nice to have mulch because it provides a barrier between it and the soil, and it allows for the water and whatever's in the soil to not touch the leaves. In this case, I will just go ahead and remove this soon, but because this is a pretty small plant still, as you can see, I'm gonna hold back on doing that just because it needs a little bit of help growing, and this leaf right here isn't fully diseased yet. So I'm just going to leave it on, but I'm probably going to remove it as the plant grows bigger and there are other leaves to support it. But for now, having this mulch here provides a little bit of protection. I don't know in your experience, but in mine, once it hits the lower leaves, it's very easy for it to spread up towards the other parts of the plant. And so I just like to kind of delay the doom and gloom of growing a tomato plant in the fog. On a related note, because I will be gone for a while, the plants will not receive the same consistency of watering and frequency of watering as they normally do, and so that kind of puts a little bit of stress on the plants. The likelihood of it developing weird looking leaves or having wilted leaves or what have you increases. So again, by putting the mulch, gives it a little bit of a cushion, a little bit of protection. Like, hey, I know it's gonna be stressful for you and you're probably going to wilt a little, but don't worry because those wilted leaves aren't going to hopefully impact you. Another benefit of mulching is it really helps keep little seedlings in place while they get stronger and bigger. This is a Merlot lettuce that I planted a few weeks ago in here, and as you can see, it's quite small, and a lot of leafy greens when you transplant them into the garden look this small, like kale and Swiss chard, bok choy, and oftentimes I notice if I don't mulch and I water the bed, they kind of sloop over into the soil, and oftentimes if they're not strong enough yet, or if you're not there to help kind of prop them up again, they can literally just die. I think it's because they get too wet, their leaves just get soaked in the water and they're not quite ready to kind of bounce back on their own, so the mulch helps lock them in place while they're still growing enough. Because like if you look over here, these Merlot lettuces are a little bit older and they can really stand on their own now, but at some point they were once like this, and I'm pretty sure I had another Merlot lettuce here that did not make it because it slooped to its death. This is really useful for me because currently I am hardening a few more seedlings before I'm off, and so it's important for me to again make sure that they have their best chance of surviving. We're back inside for a quick break because I wanted to show you my secret weapon. Hopefully none of them being smashed. Ooh, they're quite substantial, actually. They're a lot bigger than I thought that they would be. So the theory here is, as you can see, this is a terracotta plant stake. Terracotta as a material is very porous. Water can come in, water can come out. So when you stick it in the soil and you put a bottle of whatever filled with water and you flip it upside down, you put in the soil, when the soil gets drier, the water will naturally seep into the soil, allowing it to water itself. Now, this is not an irrigation system. It pretends to be. I think it says that it's like, I don't know, but I feel like this is advertised as some sort of automated irrigation system, and in some sense it is, I guess, because it allows you to water the plant while you're not there, but it is not as comprehensive as, say, connecting a tube through the hosing system, connecting them and weaving them into the different plants, and having a timer and automating when and how much they're watered. However, I am just gardening on concrete, okay? This is my best option, and this is all I have, so it's gonna have to work. And if it doesn't, well, at least you have this video so that you will never do this. So the stakes are soaking, and I'm just thinking about the bottle now. I read the paper and it said a 1 liter bottle will water your plant for approximately 7 to 10 days. It does give the caveat that larger plants may require more than one stake to properly water it. And I was just thinking about how that is quite a generous estimation for what it is. But I'm guessing that is specifically for indoor houseplants, and that makes a lot of sense because there's not a lot of volatility when houseplants are inside. They're not getting direct sunlight most of the time, and they're not exposed to more extreme weather, even though I'm in San Francisco and we don't really have extreme weather. But I am hopeful that it will at least carry me through a few days. I did want to include an additional tip for y'all if you are thinking about setting your garden up for success when you're away and you have a little bit more space to move around your containers. For me, I don't really have this option because there isn't really that much variability in sunlight in my garden. Like I said, I am gardening on top of concrete. There are 2 buildings, so really it's whatever sunlight can get into here that matters. And so on the best days, my garden gets 4 hours of direct sunlight, and I say 4 hours of direct sunlight because it really is never the case. Realistically, it's more 1 to 2 hours of really good sunlight, and the rest is indirect sunlight. And so I don't really have the option of, say, taking things and moving it into a sunnier spot or a shadier spot. But if you do, I would recommend finding the plants that you feel like are going to be the ones that are going to be on the struggle bus, the ones that are going to be like the weakest links of your garden while you're away. I would think that for me, those are newly planted seedlings. They're little babies. They're still trying to make it into this world, and so they're not as strong. Things like lettuce, kale, really where you eat the leaves, I feel like those plants can really be susceptible to weather changes and not having enough water, as opposed to, say, like a tomato plant or cucumbers, things that fruit. I feel like once they're a little bit more established, they're a little bit more hardy. And so what I would do is I would take those, you know, susceptible to dying more plants, and I'd move them into the shade. And I'm not saying like if they're in full sunlight right now to move them into your garage. I'm saying taking them into a place that has slightly less direct sunlight every day, a few less hours. I feel like that can really help the plant not stress out as much. It won't need as much water, and yes, it's not going to grow as big as if it were in that same sunny spot, but it will help increase its chances of surviving at least. I personally don't drink anymore, and so as you can see, a lot of these bottles are dusty, crusty, because they've just been buried away somewhere waiting for someone to drink them. So I'm just going to honestly empty out all of these bottles. It seems very wasteful, but at the same time, no one is drinking them in this household, and I'd rather not buy something that could potentially serve alcohol in minors. So I'm just going to dump them all out. They're all quite old anyway. I feel like they're at least like 3 or 4 years old. I know that a lot of alcohol doesn't expire, but they just are taking up space. All this to say, I just have all of these bottles that I'm ready to use up. I do have different sizes here. So I have this soju bottle, but then I also have a lot of these champagne bottles. And then I also have these skinnier hard liquor bottles. Thankfully, I have a little bit of time to experiment and to see which bottles will work better for which plants and which sizes, and if these stakes even work at all. Ideally, I would want a little bit more time, but at least I have a few days cushioned into the schedule to be able to refine whatever I need to refine. I'm really hopeful that these work though, because if they don't, then I'm screwed. The time has come. These steaks have been soaking in water for about 2 hours, and I only have 10, so as you can see, I have more than 10 plants. In an ideal world, they would all get their own steaks, but because I only have 10, I'm going to choose my favorites, or the ones that are a little bit more longer growing. For example, the squash, tomato, eggplants. I'm going to sacrifice the kale and the lettuce and the mizuna if they do go, just because those are things that are easier to replant, whereas I've already kind of dedicated some time to growing the fruiting plants. Since this is pretty much just a test, I'm going to start off with these smaller ones on the squash. I know that they're probably going to need something a little bit bigger, but I just want to start with the small one to make sure it doesn't collapse on my plant. Actually, I think I'm going to start with a tomato because I think that's a little bit easier. There's a little bit more space. Sorry, I realized I got water all over you. As you can see, it looks quite sturdy. I did lose a little bit of water when I flipped it, but it looks pretty sturdy in there. There's not a lot of wiggle room in here in terms of this thing collapsing on my plant. At least that's my hope. Nice and slow is the way to go. I say that and then I just did it super fast. This advice that I personally didn't realize until I've put in a majority of them. You want to make sure that when you're putting it in the container that you don't stab it too close to the plant, otherwise you'll disturb its root system. I feel like that's duh, but like wasn't thinking about that, and I'm glad that I didn't injure any plants putting in these bottles, but for sure try to put them in a little bit further out of the pot to make sure that you're not hitting anything important. Quick first impressions, it was a lot easier to do than I thought. A tip is don't shove it in the pot too hard, because I think I used too much force and it cracked the terracotta, but overall they can get pretty deep in there and they can support a pretty large bottle. Pretty impressed so far. Let's see in a couple days how they hold up. I just wanted to show you the progress here. I have not watered any of these plants since I last put this in, and it looks like it's doing a great job. Let's do a quick soil test. It's not super wet, but it's also not dry. Let me try here. Yeah, the area around this is a lot more wet, but if I try from here, yeah, it's looking lightly wet. This one is a way smaller bottle compared to this one. And this one is almost out. So I think I'm going to switch out the tomatoes for a bigger wine bottle. I removed them from their pots to refill, and I just wanted to make a quick note. These work best with traditional champagne or wine bottles, because for these ones, beer bottle and the cold brew bottle, I had a hard time removing them, and for the beer bottle it broke. I'm still going to use this because I think it's still usable, but I will say that it kind of got jammed in there, so if you can, try to stick with the more conventional bottles. When you're watering with mulch, sometimes you'll find that the mulch gets moved around and it reveals a little bald spot. So all you gotta do is kind of move the mulch back. Sometimes you have to add a little bit more mulch. I like to add mulch periodically throughout the season, but it's not a big deal if there's a little bald spot every now and then. I'm back! I have been gone for almost 2 weeks. I touched down last night. I'm in my garden for the first time, haven't watered anything, haven't fixed anything. I'm just taking in the sights and the sounds, so let's see how my garden fared without me. Do you see this? This did not look like this when I left. Big sunflower has got, surprisingly, this basil that I planted. This one is this is an Italian variety but more condensed. I believe it's called Emily basil. And this one right here is the holy basil over here. They're looking great for being new transplants that don't have any of the watering stakes. They look quite wet, honestly, which is quite surprising. This is the best my basil has ever looked, period. The beans over here looking great, and I think the peas did exist also over here. So many squash, and I feel like I have to pollinate a few here. How exciting. There were a few squash that didn't quite make it. This one needed to be pollinated and it hadn't been because it's covered, so I'll just yank that out. But look at this juicy squash right here. Oh my god. Looking very healthy, especially because I have just planted it in late July, and as you can see there's still some water here. So that's quite surprising because I thought that this would go through more water. This one is empty, which makes sense. This gets a little bit more sunlight than this one by like 5 minutes probably. Moving on to the tomatoes, they look great. They actually look so much better than when I had planted them. They have grown rapidly. In terms of water, yep, they're still, I don't know if you can hear that, but it didn't go through all of its water, which is surprising. Check the dirt here. Oh yeah, it's wet. So yeah, these bottles are really good for tomatoes. Let's see. This one I believe is out of water though. Yeah, they're just looking a little dehydrated, but not anything crazy. Moving on to these eggplants. This is the first year I'm trying to grow eggplant in the fall winter. I've actually never grown eggplant, period. I tried growing them last year, but I abandoned my garden shortly after, so I don't think that really counts. But they are looking way healthier than I've ever seen eggplant in my garden, so that is quite surprising. And in terms of water, I touched the soil here. It's a little damp, so I think I'm just making it back just in time because I think a few more days and she would really dry out. But look at how it is. While I was away, I was periodically checking the weather app for San Francisco just to see how everything was. Before I had left, it was getting quite cold, and that made me a little bit optimistic, one, for water, but pessimistic for my heat-loving plants that need a little bit more heat, like the tomatoes, eggplants, maybe squash. But throughout my time away, I noticed that there was actually a bit of a heat wave happening in San Francisco, so I was nervous that the water system that I had in place wasn't going to be enough, but it seems actually that it was enough. I was especially nervous for all of my leafy greens because they need a little bit more water, and they're in slightly smaller containers, or they're more compact. Like I have a lot of cabbages, they're in 5-gallon grow bags, but really I've filled them probably like 3/4 of the way at most. I have a lot of leafy greens that are compact, and when you have plants that are densely packed into a small container, it's really important to provide more water and nutrients to it, just because it's not getting as much as it would be if it was like by itself in a single container. So I like to water it a little bit more actually when they're densely packed. So I'm actually quite surprised at how well my leafy greens have done. I was kind of prepared to come back and have them all die, but they were actually quite thriving. I have my lettuce here that didn't have any terracotta stakes in them whatsoever, and they're doing fine. Even with these, I didn't even have a bottle to fill. I just filled up the remaining terracotta stakes that I had with some water. I have my celery here that I had planted the week before I left, and as you can see, it's pretty interesting. It looks quite damp. Overall, I am pleasantly surprised with how my garden turned out. I have been gone for almost 2 weeks. This is the first time I've ever come back from a trip that long where my garden not only survived but is thriving. Now I usually wait for late afternoon to water plants if I water plants, or I do it early in the morning before the sun comes out. The garden is starting to get hit by a heavy couple of hours of sun, but I thought that it was well needed, especially because I had been gone for so long. I'll just give them a little water and maybe water them again later in the afternoon, just because I'm already here and they deserve a little bit of extra love. The last thing I'm going to do, but I'm going to do it later on in the afternoon, is give my plants another round of fish emulsion, probably just a teeny tiny bit, just to give them a little bit more strength in case they need it, especially since they haven't been regularly watered in 2 weeks. And feeling very grateful to be back in my garden, grateful that it has survived 2 weeks without me, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. I hope you found it helpful, and I hope it gave you a little bit of comfort knowing that if you did leave the garden for a few days, a few weeks, it's not the end of the world. Things will survive. Things might even thrive with the proper preparation. I'll see you in the next one. Bye!